Hello everyone, Luke here, and when you think of the gaming experience, what usually comes to your mind? Now for me, it's the gaming controller. This device usually makes or breaks the video game experience, so let's go over the gaming controller throughout time.
Now, video games started all the way back when scientists were tired of curing fatal diseases and instead made games like Pong. The controllers in them were not too fancy, but video games back then, when they made it to the arcade, developers could make whatever control scheme that they needed for the game. So for fighting games, they could have many buttons. For hunting games, they could have a gun. And then in 1972, the Odyssey came out with the first ever game controller. You gotta be kidding me.
Yeah, a button and a stick. I mean, I know games were simple back then. I don't own this controller personally, but from what I've heard, it's not very comfortable.
However, it still could control many games. It worked, but as games got more complicated, they just needed more buttons. And so for the next few years, controllers went this very bad phase of just being like a phone. I mean, yeah, I know these controllers have a lot of buttons, but come on, nobody really liked this. So Nintendo came and revolutionized video games as they usually do.
Oh, Nintendo, please save us.
The NES controller. This is a good one. Just from its slick design, the two buttons. This time around, a new button was added called the D-pad. Now, you can move in 8 directions. Now, I've seen people say the edges are too sharp. Maybe my hands are small, but I've never really found this an issue.
This controller was good, but it was a pain for fighting games. There's like 4 buttons on this thing. Nintendo needed to upgrade.
The NES Zapper. This was used for games like Duck Hunt. It works well and reminds you of the Wiimote in a way.
But now Nintendo really needs to upgrade.
Now, the Super Nintendo controller. This one is actually really good for the time. I mean, you have an R and L button now, so many more possibilities. I love the dog bone design, and I love how the X and Y buttons are inverted. This one's just so good. And Sega, wow, that's a big controller. For having the same amount of buttons as the NES controller, you'd think it would be smaller. No, it wasn't that big, but there was just so much more room for buttons. There were a few revisions, so it wasn't that bad. The biggest game for the system, Mortal Kombat, was really limited with the lack of buttons. Oh, do you hear that? Nintendo's back. What? What is this? There are 3 ways to hold this controller. For 3D games, for 2D games, and for... There are 2 ways to hold this controller. It's not my favorite controller.
And the joystick being hard plastic is just awful.
I like how there's a back button now, and there's a few redeeming things. It just could have been better.
Let's jump to Sony with the PlayStation.
Wow, it looks good, no problems. The PS2 adds a joystick for 3D games.
It's a good controller, but it took 13 years to get a new design.
Probably not the best design choice. I never hated the PlayStation controllers. The controllers have the best D-pads ever, but I don't know. I think it's just a bit too basic, a bit too traditional.
So let's move on to something a bit not so traditional.
Now, Nintendo decided to make the GameCube, and its controller is much different from the competition. The purple color was just so cool. There was also a black controller, which also looks awesome.
Now, some people hate this controller. Those people are wrong. This controller has its flaws, but it's just a good controller.
First off, this... Oh gosh, first timers might be turned off by this, but it's just an awesome button layout. But it's so good. First, the A is the biggest button in the middle. It was a good design choice. It signifies that it's the main button I'll use. The small B button is in a good spot, and the Y next button's orbiting around the A button is laid out perfectly here. Now, there is still a plastic joystick, but it's much bigger, and it's in a more comfortable layout, making it just better to hold. But the best part is the L and R buttons. When pressing them is so satisfying. Hearing that click, so good.
Now, the D-pad is really small, and only one shoulder button is a bit odd, but other than that, it's fantastic. Also to know, Nintendo is still making this controller to this day for Smash Brothers.
This was also around the time Microsoft decided that they wanted to step into the ring with the Xbox controller, also known as the Duke, and it was massive. That's really all I have to say for Microsoft. The left joystick is a bit higher up instead of being level, which I actually really like. I'm also one of like 5 people who thinks that. Now, Nintendo wanted to make a TV remote with the Wii, and I know it's meant for motion controls, but I feel like we're downgrading here. This is closer to a Super Nintendo controller than the GameCube one, and for 3D games without a joystick, it wouldn't be possible. So Nintendo made the Nunchuck, sold separately.
Yeah, no, I get it. For platformers, this design is just not ideal. But one thing to redeem this controller is the motion controls. They work scary well. There's no need to drive to the bowling alley or the golf course anymore. Wow, Nintendo, you did a really good job. It would be really cool if you added the screen to the center of it, though. Thank you.
I often sometimes hear mixed reviews on the Wii gamepad. First, it's big. However, because of the screen being in the middle, it's so easy to reach every button. It's comfortable for hold, and for games like Nintendo Land, you can have two screens. So if you want to hide something that only the gamepad player can see, now you can. However, one thing needs to be stated, the battery life. It's like 3 hours. That's awful, especially for 2012. It's a comfy controller, but that battery life is atrocious. Now the Switch. You really need two Joy-Cons to actually play. Playing Smash Bros, my hands cramped up in only like 30 minutes of playing. The buttons on the Switch and the controller feel too small. I don't hate it, I think just the Pro Controller is better.
Well, game controllers can be a good portal to the gaming world, but sometimes they have their flaws. Nothing big. Like for the Wii, for playing a 3D game, you can always hook up a nunchuck or use a Pro Controller. For the NES, there's more a touchy and a precise D-pad. And for you N64 players, I'm so sorry for you.